そんなドバイさんによってトランプは何を学んでどう変わっていったんでしょうか。
So Donald Trump learned a lot from Mr. Tobias. How do you think that he changed the Donald Trump?
Major Tobias was Donald's first mentor was his father, or at least maybe not a mentor, because Fred Trump only taught, I think, the oldest son, Frederick. Donald wanted his attention, but his father wouldn't give him a lot of attention. He just was interested. Fred Trump worked all the time. And his major contribution to the family, I think, was educating the older brother the rules of the business. And Donald wanted to know, but Fred, his father, ignored him for a while until Donald made so much trouble that in his public school that his father decided to throw him into military school because that's the only thing that he thought could tame him. So when Donald Trump met Major Tobias, I think he discovered someone who was certainly a father figure, but was different than Fred Trump, than his own father, because Fred Trump was a very controlled inner person who I don't believe ever really showed his temper by yelling and screaming. He just was simply, just kept everything inside. And I think Donald has followed him up to a point. But with Tobias, when he got angry, he would let you know about it. He would scream at you and he'd hit you. And that, I think, for Donald, let him have, showed him another option, a way of living, a way of behaving that would release some of his inner turmoil, his inner tension. And so I think that Donald picked that up, and I think in later life, not so much more at the military school, but many years later in business and then as a presidential candidate and so forth, this part that Tobias had shown him, this very emotional, expressing anger, this part came out. And I don't think that Fred Trump could have been the guide for Donald in that, from what I've seen, what I saw of him. So that's one of the things he learned from Tobias. Tobias also was his coach in athletics, in baseball, certainly in baseball, perhaps in other sports also. And I think this is where Tobias began to like Donald a lot, because whatever Tobias told him to do, Donald now would do it. Tobias would say, I told him to run that way, he'd run that way. I tell him to run this way, he'd run this way. And so I think that what Donald was actually learning from Tobias was something else, was not really learning in the sense that Tobias was teaching him a lesson, but more he was learning what made Tobias happy and what made him unhappy. And I think that as time went on, Donald was able to really influence Tobias and really sort of command him. And that's what he did when he helped me out with my problem with Tobias, was he, at least he said he was going to have a word with him, which meant it's almost as if they switched positions, almost as if Tobias was the cadet and Trump was the commandant. And Trump said, I'll have a word with him, and that changed Tobias's behavior towards me in this case. So I think that's something else that Donald learned. And I think that throughout his military school career, beginning with Tobias and then with the other military officers, the adults that he did, I think that rather than being, as most of us were, fearful of them, he was in fact finding ways to be in a position of strength with them. And I think that that's why he's so comfortable now as president of the United States, by having all of these generals in his office and doing roles that traditionally military people weren't part of. I think because military school is something that Donald learned. He really learned how to behave in military school, how to win in military school. I think that learning how to win in this situation, he takes this with him to the White House, where there is no formula for winning, at least that he doesn't know because he's not a politician. And maybe he's installing a little bit of the military school in the White House right now, sort of a reflection of of that time in his life when he really did learn how to play a game like that. So I think that's what he learned from Tobias and what he learned in military school.
一方でこの生活している時のトランプ、その友達付き合いであったりとか、一方での生活、また先輩と後輩の関係みたいな、どういうふうに彼は暮らしていたんでしょうか。どういう周りからの評価だったんでしょうか。
So now, what can you tell us about how he lived in the dorm, so the barracks, and how did he friends with, how he was, dealing with his friends, or the senior, or his senior or his junior.
Right. There was the only time when I actually was in the same barracks with him was in his senior year, and he was captain of Company A. And this is the only time I really saw him commanding other cadets and taking care of other cadets. And I think that he didn't seem to have all that much interest in being the captain of that company. He would delegate responsibility. He would tell, the chain of command, he would tell different people to take care of this thing, take care of that thing. And he did once tell me, he said that this is how people in the highest executives in business ran the business. They delegated responsibility. Right? So, and I remember he had one particular, almost a confidant, who was named Peter Tickton, who was the platoon sergeant. That's several steps below a captain, but Donald trusted Peter so much that he would give him difficult tasks to perform that perhaps other cadets he didn't believe could do. And Peter would go behind the scenes and take care of these things. But this system didn't always work for Donald, and there was a situation that developed. Military school has a very strong element of hazing in it, and hazing can be some kinds of hazing were traditional in that they actually wrote about it in the regulation book. But other kinds of hazing were things that we did in the barracks or that were done to us that were very sadistic and could be very, very hurtful. And there was a young kid in A Company who just seemed to invite older cadets to haze him. And at some point he couldn't stand it any longer, and he went to the commandant and complained. And I don't know what else he did. He may have called his parents. There had been some incidences where cadets called the state police even, and the police came. So whatever he did, they had to deal with this. They couldn't just hide this. And so they moved Donald from captain of A Company, where he was in charge of maybe 30, 40, 50, 60 kids, to a position on the staff. This was a lineal transfer, so it wasn't a demotion, it wasn't a promotion, it was simply a lineal transfer. But what he did on the staff, he didn't have to deal with any cadets particularly. It was a desk job, sort of, right? And in fact, he did very well with that particular one. But as far as Donald went with other cadets, I mean, I know that when he would come and inspect us, unlike other captains, I mean, he might actually compliment us and say, your shoes look very good today, or your uniform is very well pressed, and so forth. And I heard this from other kids too, because Donald would inspect other companies and would. So that was very nice, that he would be like that. But as far as actually being involved in the lives of all the kids on a daily basis, not so much. And we would, for instance, come back from dinner, and he would go into his room and close the door, and that was it. We'd never see him until the next morning. But a lot of stuff went on in the barracks while he was in his closed room, and a lot of hazing, a lot of things like that. So they transferred someone else from the staff to A Company as the captain to take care of the problems that had existed. So Donald wasn't that good with dealing with people on a personal basis, but he was much better acting on his own and leading parades, for instance, and because he looked very good in a uniform. By his senior year, he's a very handsome man. So he actually made a big success of himself in his senior year, and part of that was by leading parades and by leading, by doing military things. He did other things too.
How did he interact with the friends?
I don't know any actual friends that he had in the sense of really intimate friendship. He had acquaintances. And I think I spoke with Peter Ticton, and he said that he was very close to Donald. And he said Donald really didn't have friends. You weren't really that close to him. He just was not like that, right? And when I first knew him and tried to be friends with him, he didn't respond in the way that I was used to having people respond when we make friends. Lots of times you tell jokes, you say funny things, you find each other's sense of humor, and that's a very important part of friendship for most people. But every time I tried to say something funny or I tell a joke or something, he would simply just look at me. It was as if the picture I get in my head is throwing a basketball into an empty court, and it just bounces and bounces and bounces, and that's it. Nobody's there to catch it, right? So later, as I knew him over the next 5 years or so, I began to feel sort of sad about this, that I really concluded that he really had no empathy for people. That instead of empathy, he was able to maybe manipulate people as if they were pieces on a chessboard, but not move heart to heart or life to life. He just didn't have that ability to do that. And I think that Shakespeare in The Merchant of Venice said that someone who doesn't have music in his heart is fit only for treasons, stratagems, and spoils. And I think that without empathy, you're only fit for those things,
ニューヨークアカデミーで彼もね、少年時代から青年になって大きく成長していったと思うんですけども、一番あそこで何が大きく変わって今の彼に生かされている。
So he spent years at the New York Military Academy from his boyhood toward the adolescent days. How did you see the changes, and that changes from getting the day he got into the military academy and then get the graduate, translate to his later on adult life?
Right. I don't think that Donald changed much as a person throughout the whole time that I knew him. And in fact, he told one of his biographers that when he thinks back on how he was when he was 6 years old and how he is today, he doesn't really see a difference. He said that the temperament, he said, is still the same. So it wasn't so much that he changed as a person, but I think what he did do, which was something we all did, was we began to assess ourselves. He began to assess himself and realize what his strengths were and what his weaknesses were and how he could develop his strengths. So the first thing he did was excel in sports.